Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session in our special seminar series commemorating the 25th anniversary of UNIGIS Portugal and the Master in Geographic Information Systems and Science. Over the past quarter century, this program has played a central role in training Portugal's geospatial professionals, advancing GIScience, and shaping the way we understand and manage our world through geographic information. Today's session constitutes that celebration by focusing on one of the most compelling frontiers in our field, modeling place in GIScience. While GIS has long excelled at representing space, the notion of place brings us closer to the human experience, embedding meanings, emotions, memories, and social contexts into the environments we study. Capturing and modeling these dimensions is a complex challenge, but also an exciting opportunity for innovation in research, urban planning, and citizen engagement. Our seminar titled Modeling Place in GIScience, Concepts, Data, and Paths Forward will explore the conceptual foundations of place, emerging data ecosystems that allow us to quantify human experience, and the analytical pathways shaping the future of place-based research. We are honored to welcome Dr. Vicente Tang, whose work sits at the cutting edge of this domain. His research joins computational methods with the lived experiences of individuals and communities, opening new perspectives on how we understand urban environments and the relationships people build with them. I invite you all to engage deeply with the ideas presented today, as they have very big implications for urban planning, community participation, and the future of geospatial technologies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vicente Tang.
Okay, so hi everyone. First, I'd like to thank Professor Marco for hosting this event and also for UNIGIS International for the initiative and everyone that is online with us. So today I want to talk about something that we all experience every day, but we rarely think about it in a technical way, which is the difference between space and place. So in the field that we are in GIScience, we have become incredibly good at mapping space. We have high-tech satellites and GPS on our phones that can tell us exactly where we are using a pair of coordinates, for instance. But as we humans experience space, we don't really live in a world of coordinates. So the big question I want to explore with you today is, can we try to put that human meaning into our digital models? So I'm going to share some concepts, some food for thought, some previous and ongoing research, and both from my authorship and from the people that have been working in this frontier. So to start our journey from space to place, here I have the map of Nova EMS campus. This is where I work every day, where I am as I speak. And I know that many of you watching today are students or either professors who walk the same areas with me. So on the screen, and you can see the location where I am right now with coordinates. On the screen, what you can see is our campus from a bird's eye view. On one side is the official map from Nova EMS website showing our classrooms and buildings. And in the world of traditional GIS, this is what we call space as support. It is a mathematical container where everything is defined by precise coordinates and Euclidean geometry. From this perspective, the campus that we are in is just geometric extent, maybe a collection of points, lines, and polygons. It tells us exactly we are in a grid, in a reference system, but it lacks any human content. So it doesn't tell us what happens inside those walls, it just treats them as spatial administrative units. But now let's take a look at Nova EMS as we actually know it. So you see place activities like preparing for exams and projects in the study rooms or where I work. The social interaction of students talking in our beautiful patio. The milestones like our graduation ceremonies and conferences and parties. This is what we call the place ballet. It's this rhythm, this daily routine and social interaction that turn these buildings, right, turn the form, the physical form into a shared place with meaning. So when we add this dimension, we add these emotions, these experiences, the stress of an exam or the joy of end of the semester party, we are infusing space with human meaning. It is no longer just a location on the map. It is a lived and a shared space that we have built together through our memories and connections. So, what is the contradiction that we have here? On one side, we have perception, memory, meaning, everything that we attach to a certain place. That's how we leave space. But GIS, Geographic Information Systems, usually represented in absolute objective ways, with coordinates, pixels, raster cells, X and Y values. And so here is the challenge. How do we go from that messy, let's say, lived experience to something that we can actually model? So the question mark in the middle is where what we call place-based GIScience research is focused on. We have here another example. For instance, on the left, we see a restaurant, but not just a business or a dot on the map. It's a place where we gather, we socialize, we talk, we eat. So there are layers of meaning here, right? And on the right, we see that same kind of place becoming just one or a set of points in a sea of red location tags in Google Maps. So GIS tends to treat places like this as spatial objects, purely points with names, coordinates, and some attributes. But what about why people go there, what they do, and how they feel? That's the gap that there is between location and place in geographic information systems. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of place, right? The concept of place is a very big concept. It's been explored across many disciplines, from geography, of course, but also environmental psychology, urban sociology, philosophy, and even architecture. So there are hundreds of definitions and conceptual frameworks. But one of the most well-known and widely quoted definition comes from Yu Fuquan, which was a human geographer who captured the essence of a place with a simple sentence, and he said, "Place is space infused with human meaning." So let's take a look at this image that we have here. We have a coordinate that marks a location on the surface of the Earth, in this case, again, at Nova IMS campus, or Nova campus, a GPS point. But when we zoom in, we see students sitting on the grass, talking, relaxing, sharing time and space. And that space, through those interactions, becomes a place. And now we can see how and why. Because places are not just locations, they are sensed through our senses, right? Through our smell, through our hearing. They are felt, they are shared, and they are shaped by conversations, memories, and so on. So they are inherently vague and subjective. So this is why they matter, and also why they're so hard to model using traditional GIS tools. Because having that nuanced meaning is messy. It's not the spatial data file, right? It's in our perception. And at the same time, that's exactly what we are trying to explore. Here I'm going to bring a little bit of relevance in the context of urban intelligence, right? And in the context of the scale of the city, why the concept of place or place-based or related concepts are important. So most of us nowadays live in cities, right? And cities aren't just physical infrastructures, they are lived environments. So in this case, urban intelligence would not be just about knowing where things are or things like traffic flows. It's about understanding how people relate to their environments, what places matter, why they matter, and how those meanings vary across different groups of residents. So that's why it's so important to put place at the center of urban research, planning, and also urban design. You see that reflected here on the left, an exercise of people mapping together, engaging in a participatory, bottom-up way of making sense of space. And on the right, a framework from the Project for Public Spaces, showing how place quality involves things like comfort, social life, access, and even imageability, how we see places. So studying places help us capture local knowledge, also collective memory, and insight from people's experience that formal data sources might often overlook. So whether it's planning a park, designing a house, or managing mobility in the city, for instance, having human-centric and place-based approaches are very important to making our cities more livable and also more inclusive. So now that we've looked why place matters a little bit, let's turn to how it actually shows up in the city. Just a few facets, right? How we can recognize and study those place-based concepts in practice. One of the most basic ways that we encounter place in the urban landscape is through its functions, right? What is that the function of that place? What do we use it for? Where we live, where we socialize, where we shop, or where we go to relax. So these are not just land use categories, right? They reflect how people experience and use different parts of the city. Here, for instance, we see a participatory mapping platform called Maptionaire, where people can draw and label areas based on how they see and use them in the city. So it's a way to bring functional place categories into the conversation from this perspective, using this bottom-up perspective. In addition to just the function of a place, whether it's residential or commercial, we can also start to see places as regions of meaning, right? Think of neighborhoods in the city, for instance. They are not always defined by official boundaries or administrative units. They are shaped by identity, by culture, by shared history, and even stereotypes sometimes. So this is what we call vernacular or cognitive regions. Places people feel they belong to, for instance, or associate with a certain community or identity. On the right, you see an example from Bay and Montello's work, where residents were asked to draw what they considered to be the boundaries of Koreatown ethnic enclave in Los Angeles. And you can see the results. They're all different because neighborhood is it's a place-based concept, not just a geometric zone. Another dimension in the context of the city is more focused on the relationship we have with places. When we talk about places in the city, we're not just talking about where people are, but how they feel about where they are. This is what we call sense of place, which are the emotional, the cognitive, and also the social bonds that people form with specific locations in the city. It includes concepts and ideas like place identity, familiarity, or even belonging. And as you can see in this diagram, one of the millions of different frameworks for sense of place, it can be seen as a web of relationships that shapes how people interact with urban spaces. So understanding and mapping sense of place gives us insights into what makes a neighborhood, for instance, feel like home, or why people fight to protect a square or a park or a specific tree in a neighborhood, or what drives general community cohesion. Okay? So now that we have explored the concept of place and its relevance in urban studies, let's take a look at how GIScience, how geographic information science, has tried to handle it. So over the past few years, there have been growing efforts to formally incorporate place into the geographic information systems, to move beyond just mapping coordinates to start representing those perceptions, attachments, and all different types of human activities. On the left, we see here a simplified version of Song Gao's framework for place-based GIS, which brings together these three essential elements. The spatial data, right? The things like photos, videos, text, and all sorts of spatial narratives that reflect how people experience a certain place. The part of the representation, the computational model, so thinking of new ways to encode, to structure the data into the systems. and the part of analysis and visualization, which makes it possible to quantify and to interpret patterns of meaning in space. On the right, we see a word network from a literature review we did a few years ago, where we looked at how the term place, some years ago, connects with other core GIScience concepts, things like space, models, geography, and even uncertainty. Now let's take a look at the representation and computational model. I know this looks a bit overwhelming. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to read or fully understand everything that is going on the right side of this image. What I want to show here is that there is a body of research of place-based GIS that is dedicated to doing something quite bold, I would say, which is formalizing the concept of place in GIS frameworks and models. That means using ontologies, using logical systems, semantic relationships, all sorts of computational models to rethink how we structure geographic information around concepts of place. So instead of simply defining locations, for instance, as X and Y, these models ask things like what kind of human activity happens here, what are people perceiving, doing, or feeling, or what are the relationships that exist between places and people. We see this in proposed frameworks like place reference systems or spatial composition. These are all part of a bigger effort to reshape the paradigm. So moving away from a GIS that is solely focused on geometry and towards GIS that recognize the complex nature of place. But that's not the only dimension to this story. We still need data to handle place in a GIS, not just coordinates or land cover. We need what is called spatial data or place data, so spatial to contrast with spatial. So data that reflects how people describe space and experience different locations, right? This can be photos, videos, text, emotions, perceptions, anything that captures the human side of geography. But the question is, where do we get that kind of data? So traditionally, data about places had come from qualitative sources, right? For instance, from gazetteers or geographic dictionaries. These were early attempts to describe places, not just by location, but by their historical and cultural importance. Then there are oral traditions, for instance, stories passed down through generations, like you see in indigenous communities, with a lot of deep knowledge about places. Methods such as ethnography and field work from social scientists and anthropologists, right, to document how communities perceive and construct place in their daily life. And we cannot forget also literature and poetry, things like novels, even music. They're all powerful sources of place-based information. These are all rich qualitative data sources, but historically they've been underutilized in GIS. So let's now take a look on more recent data sources that have started to capture place in new digital ways. Nowadays, the story is completely different, right? In today's context, data is everywhere, and almost everything comes with a location attached to it. Our smartphones, social media, apps, all kinds of sensors, they're constantly generating streams of data that are geotagged, time-stamped, and a lot of times connected to some kind of activity or content that we can check. Photos, tweets, check-ins, reviews, fitness tracks, they all happen somewhere and they carry some meaning about the location attached to it. And for researchers of place, this abundance, right, and ubiquity opens up an entirely new opportunity to start quantifying and mapping how people actually live and feel geographic space. So where exactly can we get that spatial data about places, right? We must not forget that place, there is still a location component associated to that. Well, one of the most direct ways is simply to ask people, right? We can use, for instance, participatory approaches like sketch mapping and map-based surveys to let people draw the boundaries, write about their feelings, pinpoint locations that matter to them. You can see some examples here. Projects where residents are asked to outline neighborhoods, highlight areas where they find safe or unsafe, or describe their city in their own terms. So these tools and these methods, they allow us to turn subjective perception into spatial data. So this is what we call primary data. That is because it's data that is coming straight from people's interpretation. So once we collect this kind of perception-based data and spatial data, like drawn neighborhoods and mental maps, what do we actually do with it? Well, the nice part is that we can start to work with it in a quantitative way, using spatial analysis and visualization techniques. We can measure overlap and consensus to show areas where people agree on where a neighborhood starts or ends. We can map the density of outlines, compare boundaries, or even analyze movement patterns and all sorts of sketches. So while the concepts themselves are subjective, right, we transform the output into something more objective, into spatial data in the end. So now let's take a look at how we can also use secondary data, the kind that's already out there, just waiting to be explored. Beyond those participatory methods, we also have what I just called secondary data or secondary sources. And here, as you all know, the amount of data that we have is huge. So people generate all types of digital traces all the time. Sometimes it's voluntary, like checking in, posting photos, or tagging locations. Other times it's passive or even involuntary, right? Like GPS logs, application usage, or even mobility data. So this is what researchers often call humans as sensors. We are constantly emitting signals where we are, what we do, what we feel sometimes, just by interacting with these digital tools. Platforms like you see there, Twitter, Uber, Google Maps, and many others produce vast streams of geospatial data with time, location, and some kind of human context attached to it, usually in the form of text. So researchers also refer to this as social sensing, where data from people becomes a source for understanding emotion, perception, movement, social connection, everything that can infer information about places. And once we have all this location rich data with the potential to have place characteristics, what can we do with that? So the options are actually endless. There is thousands and thousands of research on that. This kind of data also is not limited to traditional GIS tools. There are tons of studies in geography, urban analytics, computer science that use these data sources in all different types of ways. Some try to identify, for instance, functional regions through clustering geotagged photos. Others try to layer digital footprints, as you see there, onto historical cartography to explore how perceptions of place have evolved over time. And there are works that use, for instance, Flickr or Google data to compare where people focus their attention or which spots are photographed more. Each study that we have using that kind of data for exploring place has their own assumptions and objectives. But there's one common thing with all of them, which is we are not directly asking people. We are using what they do digitally and where they do it as a proxy for place-based meaning. So everything that we've seen so far has been a very, very broad and not complete, of course, landscape of place in GIScience. Now, I want to bring it back to the local urban scale and share with you a few examples of works that we've done here. So studies that explore how we attempted to map and analyze some place-based concepts in a real city. In this case, Lisbon, where I am. And Lisbon is a very good case, not just because it's a beautiful city or historic city, but because it's a city full of vernacular geographies, local and unofficial ways of understanding and naming space. So while the city, as you can see in the first map on the left, while the city is divided into parishes or freguesias, the official administrative units, the reality on the ground is far more complex. So Lisbon has hundreds, even thousands of bairros, which are those smaller, unofficial neighborhoods with specific identities. Some are tied to history, some to sense of community, some to place memory, but all of them are fuzzy and have contested borders. So this creates a kind of like a urban mosaic full of place-based knowledge that rarely shows up in formal spatial data sets. And that's exactly the type of geography that we've tried to capture in our studies. So let me show you a few of those now. In this first case study, we wanted to explore something very practical, which is what is the relationship between where people say things and what they say about places. So to do that, we looked at two different types of user-generated content with location in Lisbon. On the left, we have what we call space-based data with over 800,000 tweets. These are geotagged, meaning we know where the person was when they posted, but we don't know if they were talking about the place characteristics, about the surroundings. And on the right, we have what we call place-based data. So in this case, represented by Google Places and OpenStreetMaps. As you know, these are structured data to describe what a place is: a church, a square, a museum, a restaurant, even with reviews associated with that. And then we compare them. So the question was, do people mention things in their tweets, in this case, that match the types of places that surround them? In other words, is geotagged user-generated content a good proxy for place-based data? So for that, we used spatial and textual analysis, right? And what we found is that sometimes the content matched the location, but very often it did not. People tweet about other places, about abstract ideas, or about things unrelated to their surroundings. In this example here, you see the topic about football, which actually scored a high correlation when it comes to the content and the location, and actually a topic that has the potential of high disconnect because people do not need to be in a football stadium to talk about football. And looking at the results, we saw these correlations will depend a lot on the topic, okay? So what this project helped us reflect was on the limits of assuming that geotagged content equals place-relevant content. And it showed how we can use place-based data to test and sort of interpret the meaning of space-based information more critically. Another thing is the over-reliance on one source is something that we should be careful when inferring place-based information from the urban environment using these types of data sources, which leads to our next research paper. In this study, what we did was focusing on mapping vague neighborhoods. In this case, you see Alfama, one neighborhood in the city, in the historical part of the city of Lisbon. And we know that those sorts of neighborhoods don't have a clear official border, right? They are fuzzy, they are shaped by history, identity, and even personal experience. But for research and planning, we often need something more concrete. So we used 6 different types of user-generated content, 6 different sources. in this case, Twitter, or it used to be Twitter at the time, Instagram, Airbnb, Wikipedia, Idealista, which is a local real estate listing website, and OpenStreetMap. So each of these sources reflected a different audience or a different intention, right? From tourists to locals, from rentals to content of encyclopedia, for instance. Then we used a clustering method to generate polygon shapes that show where each dataset places the neighborhood. And we found, as expected, that the boundaries varied a lot, right? For instance, Airbnb extended way beyond the core area, while Wikipedia and Twitter were more spatially aligned with the traditional notions of the neighborhood. But despite those differences that we see, we were able to compute what we call consensus zones, as shown in the red overlap map. So even though neighborhoods are vague, right, combining multiple sources of this type of data, of user-generated content, can help us map these shared mental geographies of a place. After exploring what we could extract from these types of sources, we thought maybe we should just ask people directly. So that led to this next study that we use participatory web-based mapping survey, where residents were invited to draw their own mental maps of Lisbon neighborhoods, in this case of those three neighborhoods. And each participant sketched what they personally considered to be the boundaries of each area. And you can see those outlines here on the bottom right. Then, as expected, we did what we often do with fuzzy boundaries. We aggregated the results and created consensus zones, like the maps at the top right. And this showed the areas where most people agreed, right? But we didn't stop there. So this study went beyond just consensus mapping. We also looked at some social demographic patterns. So now it's not just about where people say a neighborhood is, it's also about who is saying it. In this part of the study, we looked at the same sketch data, but we grouped it by participant profiles based on variables like age, nationality, length of residence, and residence location. So on the left, for example, you see the neighborhood of Alfama, comparing younger and older residents. And on the right, the neighborhood of Muraria, comparing short-term and long-term residents. The colors show which areas are more commonly drawn by each group and where they overlap or they diverge. And this helps us to understand the neighborhoods, again, aren't just vague, they are perceived differently by different groups of people that share experiences, that share some background, and that share the same time in the city. In this next study, we dove even deeper into this aspect by looking at the social demographic dimensions behind those drawings. So we applied principal component analysis, PCA, to group participants by shared profiles. So things like age, education, where they live, and then try to visualize how those profiles varied in space. So you can see here how the spatial patterns shift slightly. They are subtle, but they might reveal how different groups, even within the same neighborhoods, carry different mental maps of the city. For example, recent arrivals, people that have recently arrived, that haven't been living that long in the city, draw boundaries slightly different than long-term residents. This is still ongoing work, but it opens a path to explore. So how do social identities, right, and social demographic characteristics as variables can shape spatial perception of places and neighborhoods in the city? In this case, we are still working with the city of Lisbon. Now, in this last part of showcasing my research, we come sort of full circle. We come back to space because, as I said before, we must not forget that place is not detached from space, right? In fact, the way that we experience and remember places is often attached, it's anchored in spatial form. And here we explored how the structure of the street network influences people's perception of neighborhood boundaries. We used orientation metrics and found that even though people's sketches they vary, their boundaries they often align with major streets, for instance, in this specific case. We also did that for the other neighborhoods. This brings us back to Kevin Lynch's classical work, right? The image of the city, how we remember the city through what he considers the primitives of the image of the city, such as landmarks, paths, nodes, edges, and districts. All of them actually. So the urban fabric, in this case, the street layout, act as what we call a cognitive anchor. It's not just who draws the neighborhood, but also what the city draws in our mind with its form, with its physical form. So this study begins to show how space also shapes place and how elements like street orientation, one of the many elements of urban form, can help explain some of the patterns that we find in these perception-based boundaries. Now going back to why does place matter, right? Again, in urban research and practice. So cities are not just built from infrastructure, as I said before. They are made of meaningful places, right? And understanding those places give us better tools for action. So with urban intelligence, we can go beyond sensors and beyond systems towards recognizing how people actually live and move through space. Okay? So we can identify gaps in knowledge where data is missing about communities or communities are underrepresented. There is the study of place-based health, showing how attachment and sense of place can actually affect well-being, stress, and social connection. In planning, right, in citizen-centric planning, using people's own mental maps is relying on vernacular geographies is a more grounded way than relying on arbitrary boundaries. And we can support placemaking, right? In urban design, for instance, turning areas that are sort of neutral into spaces that have the potential for identity and belonging. So now let's step back for a moment. So what does all of this mean in the context of geographic information science? Well, as I showed you today, place is a very multidimensional concept, right? And at the same time, the formal incorporation of place into geographic information science is still very scattered throughout the research. So it means that it's spread across disciplines, different methods, different vocabularies, and often isolated in different communities of research. So this diagram really illustrates that landscape, although it's a bit outdated. It shows how place sits at the intersection of human geography, cognitive science, urban planning, psychology, and so many other fields and concepts. So it's not just a GIS problem, it's a multidisciplinary challenge. But here's the exciting part, which is we do have the tools and the data. So with advances in spatial data science, geo AI, and the explosion of spatial or place-based information from digital sources that we are in a moment that we can start, we have been doing that, but we can even go further to connect those dots. So what's next? On the technological front, we are seeing breakthroughs that could expand how we capture and model things. For instance, we are talking about next generation natural language processing and large language models. For instance, this image that you see is from a paper from last year where large language models were used to classify city regions based on how people talk about them. So this isn't administrative boundaries, it's sort of like a cognitive map built from text. We are seeing generative AI being used for geographic question and answering and semantic enrichment. So helping machines better understand more human questions like where is a cozy neighborhood to live in Lisbon. We are also been seeing effective computing and geo AI. So they are unlocking new ways to sense emotional responses through visual vision models or wearables that track stress levels in public space, for instance. And I think that data fusion is sort of the glue. So bringing all these sources together to build this rich, layered place profiles. And of course, there's the theoretical side of that. So there is emerging ideas like theories of spatial information and spatial information system that aim to move beyond the old paradigm of spatial information systems or GIS. But then we come back to this to a question, which is, do we really need a new type of GIS or a new paradigm? Or can we just use the tools that we already have, maybe differently or maybe more meaningfully? So to wrap up, I want to leave you with this quote from Helen Kupelis. She's a foundational thinker in GIScience and one of the early voices calling attention of the importance and complexity of place in geographic models. And she said, the most significant spaces may never make it into a computer. Even so, the quest for the representation may prove the most exciting kind of geography we've ever done. And I think that really captures the heart of it, and that's what makes it worth exploring. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Vicente, for such an enlightening lecture. Vicente is now happy to take questions or comments from the audience. So if you'd like to place a question, please use the chat for us to pass it on to Vicente. As you think about the questions, maybe I'll start with a question about methodological innovation. So what methodological advances, such as analytical, computational, or statistic, do you believe are currently reshaping how place is modeled in GIScience?
Yeah, I think we are seeing major shifts. Relative first is, I think, large language models and generative AI. So tools that let us work with language in a more contextual way, with more semantics infused. So instead of counting keywords, for instance, we can start understanding how people talk about places using very, very, very deep corpuses of text. Then there is also sensor networks and Internet of Things, where we can monitor, for instance, real-time physiological or environmental data. For instance, projects aimed at sensing heart rate in public spaces. On the statistical side, I think things like consensus mapping, probabilistic models, or even approaches that are focused on fuzzy logic is helping us with questions of working with vague and uncertain notions, right? Which is exactly the nature of place. So I think these methods are going to be they're going to enrich a lot, especially generative AI and large language models. I think they're very promising for the new frontiers of methods of understanding and mapping place.
Okay, all right. So let's move a little bit towards the applications. What do you see are the most promising applications of place-based modeling for urban planning, policy design, community engagement? Can you enlighten us a little bit on that?
Yes, yes. Well, I think mm, mm, most of the promising applications are within the urban context, right? So I think building more inclusive or meaningful urban environments. So having place as the center in the debate is important for us to design, for instance, spaces that foster social interaction, sense of community, sense of belonging. And I think we have spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money in transforming cities, optimizing cities for efficiency and performance, right? But sometimes we have been overlooking how cities feel and how do we live in cities. So if we can center the concept of place in urban planning, we can start designing for better well-being, better social cohesion, and even better mental health, for instance. So I think that's I think that's one of the most promising applications. I mean, there's stuff that is been doing that. I'm not saying that it's not been doing, but I think where the concept of place and studying place through a GIS perspective, I think it's within the smart city discourse. Right? So approaches that are centered on place that would help us go beyond infrastructure and start thinking about urban experience. I think that's fundamental for building cities that are not just smart, but they are livable.
Okay, so our audience is not very much engaged. So I'll ask you another question about challenges and limitations. So, what do you think are the major technical challenges, major conceptual or technical challenges that can still hinder the correct modeling of place, and how we might actually or eventually overcome those?
Yeah, so I think there are many challenges, like, and big challenges, as you said, both conceptual and technical. So conceptually, inside the GIS science and GIS community, we are still asking ourselves, what is place exactly? What are its dimensions? What its importance? Um, which are the places that matter for modeling? And we don't have a consensus yet. So, and maybe that's okay, but it does make the work messy, I would say. So technically, I think when it comes to technical challenges, I think we do have all the tools that we need. Okay. The question is asking ourselves what we are modeling, right? And why we are modeling certain places or certain aspects of places. What do we want to capture? What do we want to leave out, right? And I'll say this, even though this research stream um, is still very niche, um, there are also researchers and other researchers that are starting to bring more serious theoretical depth, let's say, into the conversation. Okay, so which is really promising. I think we have all the tools we need. We just need to advance our concepts.
Okay, Vicente, we have a few questions, so we have to be brief. A few questions from the audience. So Hamin Alan asks, what happens when you don't have enough data of a place for a project? Do you have to go personally to survey the area and collect data?
Well, that depends on what is the type of place, what you're mapping, what is your um, objective. But I think so. I'm more and more oriented towards methods, are the old methods, right? Actually going to the community and going to the places and getting all sorts of place-based data, and then trying to quantify it or bring it back to the system.
Okay, and we have a final question from another person in the audience, from Tom Diaz. It says, to what extent can place-based representations challenge the legitimacy of administratively imposed boundaries without becoming instruments of geopolitical manipulation?
Oh, that's a very big question.
That's a nice question.
That's very big. So to what extent can place-based representations challenge the legitimacy? So, I mean, impose boundaries administratively, I mean, they are not completely arbitrary, right? There are reasons why we have the boundaries, all sorts of boundaries. They do challenge the legitimacy, because someone has to define the boundary, right, of a neighborhood, of, I know that it's more complex than that, right? But boundaries are, although they have reasoning, rationale behind that, they are arbitrary in some sense. So definitely those representations from the bottom up have all the potential to make us think about that. What is the difference between what people think and perceive, right, or where they belong, and what is the actual boundaries on the map?
All right. Thank you very much. One last question. I'm not sure whether this is going to be possible, because Ruben Femenia is asking if you could explain the circular small charts on page 34. Ruben, I advise you, it's logistically a bit difficult to go back to the slide and show it everybody.
Yeah,
but
yes.
You can contact us directly, and Vicente will be very happy to answer your question. Thank you all for your participation. We have arrived to the end of this UNIGIS talk, also for your contributions to today's seminar. This session, I believe, has offered valuable insights into how GIScience can help us understand the human dimensions of place, and it has been a pleasure to continue our celebration of the 25 years of UNIGIS Portugal and the Master in Geographic Information System and Science. Our next seminar will take place on March 25th, and will focus on monitoring dynamics in ecosystem service indicators with remote sensing. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, and have a great evening.